All right, we are at the end almost of the first three chapters, which is awesome. But let's go ahead and finish out. We're going to start with civil rights movement, which again, I wrote it on here, but I'm going to tell you, I had a really hard time trying to narrow this down. So I tried to stick to a timeline, added a little bit more, and we talked about some leadership in the other two. There's so much to this and so many catalyst moments and so many things that brought on the civil rights movement and so many things that it was working on, right? So like the movement itself had a wide variety of different platforms and things that it was talking about, from police violence to housing to education to buses to, like, there was a wide variety of topics. And I think that that's important because trying to narrow them down gets really hard. But the overarching theme was just, we need some equality. We need some status updates. We need some law updates. We needed some legal win. Black people specifically needed some legal wins. However, that didn't really translate into as many wins for some of the other racial groups in the country. And we're going to, again, talk about the civil rights movement probably in several different instances in this term, but I kind of wanted to hear, we're going to get this out as quickly as possible. Okay. So in 1947, the Mendez versus Westminster really talked about segregating children of Mexican descent and talking about how that was unconstitutional. And this kind of gave way to the Brown versus Education decision that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, that talked about how we're separate but equal, right? This overturned that and ruled really that, especially in educational settings, and it was used to kind of platform off of that. But in any kind of setting of a federal institution like education, segregating children out became unconstitutional. So those legal battles and in the education sector were one of those catalysts. Another catalyst was December 1st in 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat. Now, again, she has a long history of resistance before this, and several other such actions, several other refusals to give up their seats had been happening. This particular one was in the right place at the right time, and she ended up getting arrested for this, which drew the attention of Martin Luther King Jr., who then ended up kind of pivoting and spearheading this big political moment, right? This moment of resistance, and taking that moment and making it into something much bigger. In 1960, the Greensboro sit-in, and essentially this was a bunch of college kids went in and sat. It started with a couple that went in, and not a couple, like a couple of people, not like a relationship. But so a few people went in and sat in a all white diner of sorts, or I want to say that it was something to do with the school, but I could be wrong. But in the cafeteria or diner situation. And so they sat there, and a few of them sat there for a little bit, and they weren't served, and they refused service. And then the next day they had more people, and they were all refused service. And the next day they had more people, now refused service, to the point where they maxed out the capacity of the room, and there was no one else that could go in there. And essentially they still refused service and ended up closing down the institution anyway. But what this also gave way for was Black-led student organizations, for the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality. And essentially this gave a lot of student groups and Black student groups ways in which to protest and manifest change. And so in 1960, you also had, I don't know if that's an extra N in there or not, but the Boynton versus Virginia, where it talked about segregation and interstate transit was unconstitutional. And the Freedom Ride essentially really wanted to test that, right? This was about testing whether or not that Supreme Court decision was going to hold. And they didn't really have any issues in Virginia or North Carolina, but once they got to South Carolina, they were assaulted. It ended in with limited injuries. And so they got back on the road. And then when they got to Alabama, some more serious things happened. They got mobbed again, and that had some more serious injuries. They had the bus set on fire. They had to get into another bus that was raided. There was a massive amount of injuries and serious injuries. And that kind of really was another sparking point for, hey, we're still not there, right? Like we have this legal right, but it's not getting the recognition is not getting followed through in some of these southern states. And in 1964, we got the Civil Rights Act that bans discrimination in employment and public accommodations. In 1965, we got the Voters' Right Act, restoring voting rights to all citizens of any gender, nationality, ethnicity, religion. I'm missing some in there, I'm sure. And then in 1965, you have the Civil Rights Act, which bans discrimination in housing. So that was just an addition to the employment in public. Yes, that is a dog tail getting me, in case you're wondering. Pepper, what are you doing? We have a new dog, and she's very active still because she is very young and is still working on it. But anyway, so let's get into this. The main goal was to end Jim Crow era laws, specific key legal wins, which a lot of those happened, changing social views, which happened for the most part, and making powerful allies, including JFK, then Johnson, as civil unrest continued. But it was not without opposition, right? So Hoover definitely opposed everyone and everything because that's kind of what he did. He was not about progress, and he saw anything that was making progress as a threat to national security and used that as a justification to shut down major movements and major people and key people in movements. And again, we're going to talk about how some of this is cyclic, and how some of these same measures are still being enlisted as we move through the course of the semester. Multiple arrests, and they also outed Bayard Rustin. We're going to talk about him in just a minute because he's a very important figure in the civil rights movement that tends to get overshadowed because he was a gay man, so who had in an interracial relationship. The assassination of MLK Jr. on April 4th, 1968, and the assassination of Malcolm X on February 21st in 1965 also were catalyst things. And it makes you wonder how much more momentum, if any of these persons would have survived, what the momentum would have looked like. Where would it have gone from there? And a lot of the momentum as these assassinations, and then JFK got assassinated as well. And Robert Kennedy. And so there was like an escalation of these assassinations that was really proving that violence was going to win the day, that it was going to stop the progress. And in a lot of ways it did. There were still things happening. It just wasn't, it didn't have the same momentum. And we're going to get into that. Martin Luther King Jr. Again, yesterday was Martin Luther King Jr. Day here in the US. So it's something that's very important. It's something that needs to be a moment of reflection, but also for the people of color in this country, it's a moment of celebration of a man who did immeasurable amounts of good. That does not mean he's not without fault. Everyone has them. But for the most part, this man is an absolute champion of equality and rights. He had some exceptions when it came to religion and sexuality, and we can get into that in another lecture if y'all want to. His main key contributions to the civil rights movement were the bus boycott in Montgomery. Companies needing those patients were forced to change their policies and lobby for new laws in favor of equality on the buses. His I Have a Dream speech, but don't worry, that was not the only powerful speech he gave. He actually ended up giving about 2,500 speeches all over the US and wrote 5 books and numerous articles. He was a scholar that held 5 honorary degrees. He was arrested over 25 times during, or, well, I think it was over 25. I said over 20 for protesting and activism related measures. His nonviolence as a measure for social change was kind of one of the biggest parts of his campaign. And he learned that from Bayard Rustin, which we're going to get to here in a minute. And he was also a member of the executive committee for the NAACP, which was a very respectable title for sure. And so he was a lot of the momentum and a very public figure. He was a very prominent speaker, and he was somebody that was listened to. And his nonviolent tactics were things that resonated with a lot of people who couldn't. He resonated with a wide variety of age and a wide variety of worries. So if, say, you had kids and you wanted your kids to be part of this and you wanted to take them to a rally or to a march or what have you, you were much more likely to be able to do that with MLK than you were to be able to do that with, say, Malcolm X. And so it allowed this space for there to be kind of multiple visionaries and multiple different frameworks for which ideas could be put forward. Because Malcolm X really stood for racial pride. He was part of Black Islam. However, there was some disengagement with the Nation of Islam, which could or could not have contributed to his death. More than likely, it did. 3 men were arrested and tried for that, but they were also acquitted. So there's a whole lot of suspicion, we'll go with, wrapped in this. His father was also murdered. He was raised in extreme poverty, and his mother was committed due to trauma. He and his siblings were sent to foster homes. He excelled in school, but didn't really have the social support he needed, so he ended up turning to kind of petty crimes. And while in jail, he joined the Nation of Islam. He resonated with so many Black people, though, because he never denounced his anger, his bitterness, disappointment, or desperation. He talked to people at an emotional level, and it resonated. It resonated because it wasn't just about, hey, we need to do this change, or hey, we need to look perfect all the time, or hey, look, if we're model citizens, we're going to be accepted. It was, no, F this. This is not okay. And I have every damn right to be angry. And he was right. And that resonated with a different, sometimes the same group of people, but it resonated in a way that allowed pride and a range of emotions and not letting loose, but like an ability to breathe through and breathe out the lived experiences of individuals who were facing such extreme discrimination, and in a way that acknowledged the marks it left, both physically, emotionally, mentally, the draining that it was on the souls and bodies of Black people. He acknowledged and he gave space to kind of allow for that. And that was one of the biggest things that really bolstered him to such a platform. He also spoke everywhere from inner cities to college campuses. So he understood that there was a wide variety of people that wanted to hear people talk. He wanted more activism, and that's really where the big split was with the Nation of Islam. He said, I want more action. I don't want just words. I want to, we want to do things. We want to, get together. He was survived by his wife and his six daughters. He very much was focused on economics. He was very much focused on trying to figure out ways that could not reset, but make viable, the amount of economic disparities that have happened in the history of racial discrimination in the US. All right, so we're going to talk about the Black Panther Party and Bayard Rustin, and then we're going to keep going. And I put these two together because they tend to spark a lot of controversy, though they tend to also be fairly, like, there's some overlap, but there's also some very key distinctions. And I want to talk about the fact that the Black Panther Party they were not all these Black nationalists. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist, but again, they were pitted in this media frenzy in order to make Hoover's actions against him justified. If we show a movement as violent, then we can do violence to them, is essentially this framework. And you're going to see a lot of that reoccurring through the civil rights movement, reoccurring through Black Lives Matter, reoccurring through several different movements between then and now. But the Black Panther Party was more than that. It was a new forming political party. They attempted to really, they were founded on this idea of equality and equity. They were founded in 1966, and they were patrolling neighborhoods to protect Black people from acts of police brutality. I don't know if some of this is sounding familiar, but it probably should. They had this very Marxist ideology that thus criminalized as and thus they were kind of called communists. But what people don't really think about is that Marxist idea of what communism was and what socialism was are completely different than what is actually panned out. What is called communism at this juncture is not anything like what Marx laid out as what communism should look like. And that's part of it, because the power structures that were at bay when these communist states or nation states were put together is very wholeheartedly different than what Marx was picturing in the overhaul of hierarchical structures, right? However, their idea with Marxists was really, we need to reframe this in a way that is equitable for everyone, as opposed to this really big economic curve where there's an extreme amount of impoverished persons and an extreme amount of accumulation of wealth at the top. They wanted to release all Black persons from jails and consider reparations for harms done. They were mostly college students and young people from a post that were formed post Malcolm X's assassination. They formed and came from many collegiate programs for Black students, including some of those Black university programs that were talked about in the beginning. And they formed many community resources such as education, tuberculosis testing, legal aid, transportation assistance, ambulance assistance, and the manufacture and distribution of free shoes for poor people. So this was a community-driven goals to help further the gains in education and resources, allowing people to be able to get to an economic equality was the goal here. Angela Davis is well known as part of the Black Panther Party, though she never technically was part of it. She's a badass. We will probably talk about her again when we talk about the judicial system, because she wrote an amazing book called Is Our Prisons Obsolete? It's a little bit older, but it's still completely relevant. And it's short and sweet, and I encourage you all to read it. But she really talked about having allies. She's also has a really interesting past where a gun that she had registered to herself, she was a tenured faculty position and was brilliant, had a PhD, was already lecturing. And a gun that was registered to her was part of a violent incident, and she was getting persecuted for that, and she actively argued her own case in court and got acquitted by an all-white jury, which is kind of fantastic. But also on top of that, she shouldn't have needed to have to do that. But the fact that she did it and did it so flawlessly shows how much of a badass she is. She ended up fleeing the US for a while, and taking political asylum in Cuba, I believe. And then when she came back, she is still rocking out some activism. She's in part of some of the documentaries we're going to watch. And she is very, very active in the feminist community and just in the rights and any kind of activism community. She is one of the awesome. And then we're going to talk about one of my personal heroes. His name is Bayard Rustin. He is a gay Black man who essentially was the backbone of several of the civil rights movements, like moments, and is the one that is currently swept under the rug intentionally because of his sexuality. He boycotted with his in his college years, decades before Rosa Parks. They were doing bus boycotts and actually got his first arrest from those. He was arrested later and held for a much longer time for being gay, specifically kissing a white man in the back of his car. And because of that, ended up serving a good amount of time. And thus, some of the people like Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the others were hesitant to continue to put him in the front lines because they wanted to they knew that his sexuality would be used against the movement, and so they kind of backed up from him. He heavily influenced MLK, especially in his nonviolent tactics, because he spent a good amount of time studying Gandhi and overseas. He also worked on, while he was overseas, worked on nonviolent tactics to work against nuclear weapons and the production of nuclear weapons. He facilitated the March on Washington, and as he did that, he was really good at working with women and treating them really well on his staff. He continued working on social movements until the 1990s, including the LGBT rights movement. And then he was also a big name in. He focused on economic inequality. And then I also just want to touch base on Black women as social leaders. Black women are at the core of every big social movement there has been in US history, just for the record. They've been educators, facilitators, nurses, messengers, especially when it comes to the civil rights movement. There would have been no civil rights movement without strong Black women leaders. And while their names are not on this list, I can comprise one if we want one. They're harder to find, and that's partly because the way we look at this, when we think the civil rights movement, we think Malcolm X, we think Martin Luther King Jr., we think Black Panther Party, we think all of these things, but we don't necessarily put into that the amazing amount of Black women who were prominent in making all of this possible. And so we want to make sure that we're giving credit where credit is due. All right, we're almost done, everybody. I know I said that already, but this time I'm serious because this is the last big one we had. All right, so new racisms. This is when we started moving into post the civil rights movement. We moved into this kind of new ideology of what racism is. And it's no longer kind of acceptable to overtly be racist, though I would argue that that's not necessarily the case at this juncture in US history, but we'll get into that. Post civil rights movement, you must make this social hierarchy seem more normal, more innate, as opposed to being outright with your intentions. It was more about how can we sneakily make this how things are. And this process is called naturalization, and basically it just means that you're going to make a hierarchy or a power structure look like it's been there for so long, or look like it's natural, or talk about it as natural and then as something that's always been there, so that it doesn't get questioned. But the problem with that is there's a lot of people questioning it. Even with the anti-discrimination laws, many of the same issues persist, such as discrimination in housing and lending practices, the economic discrimination, the social stigmas, and mass incarceration. And we'll get into many more. Um, Biological racism is this idea that white people are genetically superior to people of color. And again, we've talked about this. This is linked again to that scientific racism and kind of threaded that same needle. The cultural racism is a way of thinking that attributes disadvantaged racial groups lacking of prosperity to their behavior or cultural rather than their structural factors. So this is where you tie in that bootstrap Smith or that American dream. They were just trying harder. If they were just giving all they had, and then they would be able to climb up from poverty, or they would be able to do this, or they'd be able to achieve this, or look, there's this one person of color that has achieved this. So obviously everybody can do it, right? There's all of these notions mixed in, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about colorblind racism as we talk about the rest of these issues and discriminations within our society. And then we talk about the hidden curriculum and the difference in the treatment in schools. This hidden curriculum is this idea of what we don't teach and how we teach the stuff that we do, right? When we talk about civil rights movement, what are we talking about? Who are we talking about? In what ways are we talking about? You know what I mean? Like there's hidden messages in what we don't talk about. There's hidden messages in how we talk about things and what we leave out. There's hidden messaging and constantly talking about our country and how great it is, but not talking about the parts of it that have been ugly and horrific. And that matters. And then there's stereotyping. And then you're going to have colorblind racism or universalism. And that's the idea that we should kind of ignore skin color. It provides the best framework for shaping a world without racial discrimination. We just don't see color anymore. And there's kind of 4 ways in which this happens. You're going to have that abstract liberalism, which is like, well, they have individual choices, keep people in the bottom tiers of their socioeconomic situation. So again, if they just pick themselves up by their bootstraps, they'll be fine, right? They just have to keep trying. And then there's this naturalization, or the way the world happens because that's the natural way the world likes. Example, people just like to be around people that are like them. It's not that we're discriminating. We just like to be around people who are like us, right? That's code for it's natural to be separate. It's natural to not engage. It's natural to keep this hierarchy where I have power over you. And that's not the same thing as acknowledging those differences, acknowledging those power structures, and working to make sure that they are more equitable. And then you have cultural racism. It's just your cultural. You can't help it. You should change your culture, not me. I mean, you guys have to do the work, not me. I'm good. I don't see color. It's fine. And then minimalizing racism. So racism doesn't impact you that much. It's not the main reason you're in this position you're in. So like you didn't get that job because of your race. You just didn't get it because somebody else was better or somebody else did a better interview or what have you. You're just talking about race because you're a person of color. Like that's the lines where then it becomes this colorblind ideology of microaggressions, tons and tons and tons of microaggressions that work to invalidate and work to gaslight people of color into thinking that, well, not into thinking, they know their truths, but into an understanding that the world is not going to hear them. And that's not where we need to be if we're going to talk about racism. And these rhetorical strategies are just ways of expressing these ideas without being labeled a racist. And so it's, I'm not a racist, but, or, most qualified people are white people. Or, I mean, should people really have worked hard to give up their lives, wealth, and status? I mean, should people have to just give up everything they have to make the world equal or what have you? Like it's these little things, or it doesn't have to always be about race, or it's not about race. It's just the mermaid in the new, like Ariel shouldn't be black. I mean, she's always been white. So that's just how it is. It's not about race. It's just, I want it to be how it is, right? These little key messagings where it's about race, it's about racism, but it's being presented as this like invalidating way in order to make the person feel like they're not doing something wrong. All right. So 2012 through 2016. And yes, I know there's a wide berth of 1980s and policies and things and that do with mass incarceration. And we're going to get there, but that's in a different chapter. So yes, I know there are pockets here that we're not getting to right now. But in 2008, the first Black president is elected, and that's Barack Obama. And in a lot of ways, this was considered this palatable Black person, right? This person that spoke and was educated, had a white parent, was educated by that white parent, spoke in a way that made sense, didn't make too many cultural references to the Black community, but also didn't deny the Black community, and kind of threaded this line where he was allowed to be Black, but only a certain level of Black. And it was really hard to watch that be navigated. And I love Michelle Obama for not playing into that game as much, and not doing that. I do think that he was coached, Barack Obama was coached in a lot of ways to make sure that he toned down his specific ties to any kind of Black culture. And I think that that's sad, that's how we had to get our first Black president. And I think that as we move forward, we're going to see where this goes, or if we're going to move backwards. But because every moment of progress comes with backlash, the backlash came in the form of Donald Trump, who ran on and continues to promote galvanized white supremacy. And by that, we mean he continues to say shit that is wholeheartedly racist and disrespectful, continues to promote, well, here I've got a list. Hate crimes continue to hit an all-time high when he was in office. Promotion of the few people of color that will support him, but kind of denying the rest. He considers laziness and criminals and has called Black people such. He talks about the exceptional few in the sense of there's a few Black people that, you're one of us. You're not really a Black person or what have you. He talks about how Mexicans are all bad. He's labeled them rapists and drug dealers. The anti-Semitic supporters and how much he has supported them back and called and honored them and given them space. He talks about all African countries as shithole countries, and created a bunch of travel bans connected to the Middle East and countries that are from any kind of non-Christian based religious ideology. All right. And then we're going to talk real quick about the other book. That's the last chapter, or the last reading we had. And really, I just like this reading because it talks about kind of something that we talk about in this. When you talk about American history, you don't end up talking a lot about the people that are outside of the Black-white dynamic. And this is where a lot of our racial diversity gets pushed under a rug or not talked about, right? And he talks about how he was at a conference listening to a prominent speaker about racial inequality. And they kept talking about the differences between the perspectives and lived experiences of Black people versus the perspectives and lived experiences of white people. And finally, at the end, he's like, whoa, wait a minute. Where are all our brown people? Where are all the people that look like me? And essentially the answer that he was given was, you're not in it. You're not here. You're not in it. This is not about you. And that gatekeeping again, and talking about our people of color and the way in which the world has reacted to them, because there's so much uniqueness to marginalization, and then it gets compounded depending on the other identities you have. But I think this is a good read because it's very approachable. It's very real. He does a really good job of storytelling. I like that he uses kind of this metaphor of his mom having to deal with the fact that she's had her illness even before she knew she had it, with this idea of I had to deal with my skin and my racial like classification essentially long before I had to actually like acknowledge it, if that makes sense. He talks about the ways in which you get banned, like um brown folks get banished from certain conversations and create this like lack of representation. One of the quotes I put in here is that I'm in charge of the words I don't speak. And he talks about why his call became talking about the ways in which there isn't representation for people that look like him. There isn't really hard conversations being happened for people that look like him. And that when he doesn't speak up, when he doesn't say those words, he's in charge of the words that he doesn't speak, as well as the ones that he chooses to. But I also want to note and make note that this is an incredibly powerful piece, but it's not just on him. And it shouldn't just be on him as a person of color to have to consistently correct, right? And educate and teach, right? That's one of the reasons I do the job I do, is because I don't think it should fall wholeheartedly on people of color to educate and teach about these topics. The other quote I pulled was, I believe in the alchemy that arises from the power of understanding. And he talks a little bit about how understanding is made up of all sorts of different pieces. And then when you put those together, you create understanding. And part of that is knowledge, and part of that is listening. And I also liked that he asked the question, where did I sit on the bus? You hear about this all the time, right? The bus sit-ins, Rosa Parks, that's one of the things that's taught to almost every person as they walk through US education. The public transit was used by almost all racialized groups, all minorities. And that was because most of them lived in areas where that transportation was not accessible to them economically outside of public transit. And so asking the question, where did I sit on the bus, is valid, and also something I didn't have an answer to. I couldn't tell you, because despite the fact that I've done extensive research on the civil rights movement, it doesn't talk about that, right? And part of that is, again, when we talk about this hidden curriculum, this is also what we're talking about, because all of these moments in history, all of these super important topics also are relevant to multiple of our minority groups. And so we need to, and I will try as the course goes on to make sure that we're talking about multiple groups, make sure that we're bringing up multiple perspectives. Okay, we made it through the history part. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for making sure that you gave this time and energy and space. Go do something to take care of yourself, because this is heavy, and we will touch base again on the next heavy topic. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please do not hesitate to come talk to me.